Aurora died on New Year's Eve in the 13th year of her marriage to Lyra. At that time, he was having the New Year's Eve dinner with his lover and son. She watched as Lyra gradually went crazy after her death, and finally died alone on the same New Year's Eve night. When she was reborn back to her university days, she decided to cut off this evil relationship that had entangled them for decades and stay far away from Lyra. But she didn't expect that Lyra had also been reborn. Aurora died on New Year's Eve in the 13th year of her marriage to Lyra. Through the window covered with frost, she saw the fireworks bursting in the city. The overwhelming golden sparks fell from the sky, blooming with the last beauty before they faded. The caregivers had all been given a holiday to go home for the new year. She sat alone on the balcony on the second floor, looking at the gorgeous fireworks in the distance. The thin layer of ice had formed on the water cup in her hand. What was Lyra doing now? Was he celebrating the new year with Sable? She wondered. Their family of 3 should be sitting around the table having the New Year's Eve dinner, or watching the Spring Festival Gala. Lyra and Sable's youngest son should be shouting and playing in the living room. It must be very lively. Aurora moved her frozen hands and gently touched her belly. It was cold there, without a trace of warmth. It was hard to imagine that there had once been a little life being nurtured there. If her son had been born, he should be about that old now. It's just that she didn't have that good fortune, and her fate with this child was ultimately a bit thin. Snowflakes fell profusely from the sky, as if it were a grand divine punishment. Aurora stared blankly at everything in front of her. Her body, which was only wearing a single layer of clothing, somehow didn't feel cold at all, and even her spirit was much better. She probably knew that she was experiencing a flash of lucidity before death. After thinking for a while, she slowly picked up her phone. Her hands, which had lost all feeling from the cold, pressed the number several times before finally dialing it. She wanted to say a few words to Lyra for the last time and bring an end to this enmity that had entangled them for more than a decade. The phone rang for a long time, but no one answered. It stopped abruptly in the lonely darkness. Lyra didn't answer. Forget it. Perhaps this was fate. She let her hand drop, and the phone rolled to the ground, its screen going black. The last glimmer of light in the room also disappeared. After coming this far, their relationship was probably truly worn away completely, which was why she couldn't even say this last sentence. The lights in the distant city were flickering, and it was extremely lively. Aurora sat on the balcony of the villa on the halfway up the mountain, looking at the increasingly blurry horizon. It was getting darker and darker in front of her eyes, and she felt that her whole body was gradually becoming warm. All her consciousness had become blurred, before the last trace of clarity dissipated. Aurora thought, if there is an afterlife, she doesn't want to meet Lyra again. It's too painful. Loving him is too painful. The world fell into darkness. Aurora didn't expect that her consciousness didn't dissipate after her death. The next morning, she watched as the caregiver, who was terrified by her corpse and screaming, shivered and dialed Lyra's phone. Lyra came quickly. In less than 20 minutes, he stood in her bedroom, looking travel-worn. It was rare to see him in such a sorry state. The collar of his clothes wasn't turned up. His hair was a bit messy from the wind, and even his shoelaces weren't tied. However, he was so good-looking, with deep-set facial features and a cold expression. Those messy clothes didn't detract from his handsomeness at all. Aurora stared blankly at him. Compared to when he was young, Lyra in his 30s had a bit more maturity and stability. However, at this moment, his usually unflappable expression had changed. He first stared blankly at her or a stiff corpse for a while, and then he actually came up and gave her a slap without mercy. Aurora was stunned. Come on, bro. She's already dead. What kind of hatred is this? The dead should be respected. The caregivers around were also taken aback and dared not speak. Lyra gritted his teeth, shook Aurora's cold shoulders vigorously, and said viciously, "Stop pretending. Aurora. Don't you fucking pretend to be dead for me." Aurora was so angry that she almost lost her soul. If she could touch him, she would definitely give him a good slap to make him open his dog eyes and take a good look. She was already cold, and her corpse was already stiff. What the hell was she pretending to be dead for? Seeing that Aurora's corpse didn't respond, Lyra simply grabbed her and tried to pull her up from the wheelchair. I haven't even avenged myself yet. And you just die on me? I'm telling you. It's not that easy. Hatred surged in Lyra's eyes. And he kept squeezing her hand, turning it blue and white. I'll grind your bones to dust and scatter your ashes. Aurora's consciousness froze in midair. And her emotions ebbed away like flowing water. That's right. The reason why Lyra was so out of control was nothing more than that he felt he hadn't tortured her enough. Yes. After all, there was a deep enmity between them. She was the daughter of the murderer who killed his parents. She knew that he hated her so much. But Aurora didn't expect that even after her death, his hatred couldn't be alleviated in the slightest. Lyra wasn't just talking. He really dragged her corpse up forcefully and pulled her out by the arm. The stiff and cold corpse hit the ground, making her hair disheveled and looking extremely in a sorry plight. Aurora clenched her fists. She didn't know why. Even though she was just a wisp of consciousness, she could still feel the excruciating pain. Aurora wanted to say, Lyra, you're so cruel. Your parents are dead. But my parents are also dead. Now I'm dead too. I'm already dead. Won't you let me go? I've been married to you for 13 years. Had an abortion. And compensated you with all my youth and even my life. Isn't that enough? Lyra dragged Aurora's corpse all the way from the 3rd floor to the 1st floor. The moment he pushed open the door, the dazzling sunlight outside made him squint his eyes. He looked at Aurora's pale corpse in the sunlight. It was cold and motionless, without the slightest rise and fall. I don't know if the sunlight was too dazzling, or if Lyra felt uncomfortable because she had died too easily. Aurora actually saw his eyes glistening with tears. And a tear fell unexpectedly, hitting the snow and melting a small hole. He slowly squatted down, covered his eyes, and his voice dissipated in the wind. You fucking. Why did you have to die? Aurora was stunned when she saw this. And her heart was filled with mixed emotions. That bit of hatred also disappeared without a trace. Anyway, having fulfilled l'access, she was already dead. And that body didn't have any feelings anymore. So she might as well let him do whatever he wanted. Lyra squatted in the snow for several hours. The snowflakes fell on him and gradually accumulated a layer. He was as motionless as an ice sculpture. Even more silent than Aurora's corpse on the ground. Aurora thought, since Lyra hated her so much, he would probably really grind her bones to dust and scatter her ashes. He might scatter her ashes, leaving her with no place to rest after death, but unexpectedly, Lyra still had a bit of remaining integrity. He found a graveyard and buried her. It was quite expensive. Actually, that small plot of land cost more than 800 yuan, which could even buy a really good car. Maybe rich people just have too much money to burn and don't know where to spend it. Aurora watched as Lyra had her body cremated and buried her. He didn't cry again. She vaguely thought that the tear that had fallen in the snow was just her imagination. Her house was sold. Her property was donated. And all her things were burned by Lyra. The traces she left in this world were getting fewer and fewer. Aurora thought that their evil relationship was going to end like this. And Lyra would also get back on track, living a good life with his family of 3 and getting out of the hatred. But she didn't expect that after her death, Lyra was like a completely different person. All the things she left behind were burned by him. Except for the phone that had the missed call from her before she died. Lyra often stared blankly at that missed call. He didn't say anything. Didn't show any expression. Just stared at it motionlessly. I don't know what he was thinking. At first, Sable could tolerate it. But later she couldn't stand it anymore and started arguing with him. Lyra never backed down. And the arguments became more and more frequent and escalated. So Lyra simply stopped going home. He bought another villa in the suburbs, and every night after work, he would go there and look at that phone call that could never be answered. Sable couldn't stand it any longer. During one argument, she snatched the phone and threw it on the ground fiercely. Her face was distorted, and she shouted hysterically, "Aurora is already dead. Dead. What's the point of you always looking at this phone? She'll never come back to life. Who are you putting on this act for? Didn't you drive her to death?" Aurora had never seen Lyra so out of control. His bloodshot eyes were as ferocious as a devil's. For a moment, she even suspected that he wanted to kill Sable. But in the end, he didn't do it. He just quickly picked up the phone and ran 3 red lights all the way to the nearest mobile phone repair shop. The phone was already shattered, and the electronic components had fallen out. The shop owner looked at it and said it couldn't be repaired. Lyra held the phone tightly, his knuckles turning white. He leaned against the counter as if he had lost all his strength, his eyes blank. He was like a child who had lost his most precious toy. The phone was finally repaired. He spent a large sum of money, enough to buy dozens of phones. But that missed call could never be recovered. 3 years after Aurora's death, Lyra and Sable separated. Lyra didn't want the child and gave Sable the house, the car, and most of his property. On the day he moved out of the house, Sable looked at Lyra. The deep love of the past had long since turned into an unresolvable hatred. She looked at Lyra and squeezed out venomous words from between her teeth. Word by word, Lyra. If I had known this. Why didn't you die with Aurora? Lyra looked back at her, his eyes calm. He didn't say another word and turned around and left this home. 10 years after Aurora's death, Lyra didn't remarry. He bought back the house where she had died. But the interior decoration had long been removed, and there was no trace of its former appearance. He often sat on the balcony where Aurora had died and quietly looked out the window. I don't know what he was thinking. It's not that he was paying tribute to her, because he never visited her grave. Aurora sometimes wondered what Lyra was really thinking. There was a time when they had deep feelings for each other when they were young. But after tormenting each other for more than 10 years, they had long reached the point of loathing each other. Why did he put on such an attitude? If it was said that he still loved her, Aurora didn't believe it. As early as when he pushed her down the stairs for Sable and made her lose the child, the last bit of love between them had disappeared. Over the years, although he had married Aurora, he had ignored her. After she became seriously ill, he just left her alone in the villa in the suburbs while he lived happily with his own family of 3. Marrying her was just to hurt her better. Aurora thought that perhaps he just felt that she wasn't miserable enough to ease the hatred in his heart. 20 years after Aurora's death, Lyra finally died too. It was stomach cancer. He has been all alone these years and didn't even hire an nanny to take care of himself. He gave up on his lover and son, sold his company, and just curled up in this villa all day long, in a daze and drinking. His constant heavy drinking and irregular eating habits quickly ruined his stomach. It's ridiculous to say, but he also died on New Year's Eve. He sat on the balcony alone and passed away quietly. This scourge is finally dead. Aurora feels a sense of pleasure as if she has avenged a great wrong. However, after the initial elation, a faint sense of sadness wells up in her heart. She can feel that her consciousness is getting more and more blurred. Perhaps the only reason she's still in this world is because of her lingering resentment towards Lyra. Now that he's dead, dying alone on New Year's Eve, all by himself, solitary, just as miserable as she was, she doesn't hold any grudges anymore. And it seems that she's about to be reincarnated. The feeling all over her body is getting more and more numb, and the scene in front of her Aurora's eyes is gradually fading away. She can feel her consciousness slipping away continuously. Before she left, Aurora made a wish. She hopes that she and Lyra won't meet again in the next life. From being deeply in love to tormenting each other, this doomed relationship that has lasted a lifetime should come to an end. I don't know how long it took, but her consciousness returned. Aurora opened her eyes and suddenly sat up, looking at the blue bed curtain around her. The memories that had been too blurred due to the passage of time slowly welled up. She remembered that this seemed to be the bed curtain she used in the dormitory during her college years. Aurora was stunned. After a moment, she tremblingly reached out her hand and picked up the mobile phone on the bedside table. The screen of the mobile phone lit up with a blue light, looking like a ghost in the dark night. She looked at the time displayed on the mobile phone screen and was struck with shock. It was November 4th, 2022. She had returned 33 years ago. She was reborn. Aurora was reborn. She lay in bed for half the night before accepting this fact. The scenes of her previous life flashed before her eyes like a movie. The deep love she had with Lyra when they were young. And then the intense hatred she felt after learning that her father was the drunk driver who had killed his parents. In order to get revenge, Lyra endured it for a whole year and married her. At that time, she was completely immersed in happiness and was full of joy to marry him. However, she sat up until dawn on their wedding night but didn't wait for him. Later, she found out that he had gone to accompany Sable that night. And they had lingered until dawn in the same hotel where they got married. At first, Aurora didn't understand why Lyra seemed like a completely different person after they got married. The deep love of the past was gone. He ignored her, scolded her, and stayed away from her, making her extremely sad and confused. Later, Lyra got drunk once. A month after that night, Aurora found out that she was pregnant. She had thought that this child could win back Lyra's heart. This was her child, her continuation. A little thing that she was willing to risk her life to protect. Then came that nightmarish night. Aurora closed her eyes and felt the wetness sliding down the corners of her eyes. Sable knew that she was pregnant and came to her door, forcing her to have an abortion to make way for herself. During the argument, Lyra came back. Sable pretended to be pushed and let out a cry of pain as if she was about to fall. Lyra, in order to protect Sable, pushed her hard. She rolled down the stairs. She felt intense pain all over her body but seemed to be unconscious. She just protected her belly with a pale face. A stream of warm blood gushed out from below. Looking at Lyra's shocked gaze, she blacked out. Perhaps there really is such a thing as a blood connection. In the dark, she felt that something more important than her life was slipping away from her. That small ball of light lingered around her reluctantly. In her dream, she begged it with all her heart not to leave. And she almost cried herself dry. But it still flew away and finally disappeared. When Aurora woke up, she knew that her child was gone. After that, Sable came to make trouble at Herd where every now and then. She finally understood why Lyra treated her like this. But this time, she didn't want a divorce. She thought that these people had killed her child. She would rather torture each other with Lyra until they died than let them have a happy reunion. Lyra didn't mention divorce either. The two people who were competing to hurt each other maintained this relationship with such tacit understanding. It's ridiculous to say that marriage is supposed to be proof of two people in love growing old together. But now it has become a means of torturing each other. In the end, Sable didn't get to marry Lyra. Until Lyra died, Sable's son could only be an illegitimate child. Thinking of this, Aurora felt mixed emotions in her heart. The emotions were so intense that she started coughing. As she coughed, tears welled up in her eyes. She thought that God had shown mercy and given her another chance to live. Whether the previous life was good or bad is in the past. In this life, she wants to stay as far away from Lyra as possible and cut off this doomed relationship. The next day, having fulfilled session, Aurora went to class with her roommate. It felt very fresh for her to be back at the age of 19. In fact, she wasn't very old when she died in her previous life, only in her 30s. But more than a decade of suffering had left her exhausted and her heart completely dead. When walking with her roommate on the way to the teaching building, they passed by the basketball court. Aurora was walking when suddenly a black dot flashed across the sky not far away. Then, let out a low sigh. In her shocked eyes, a basketball hit her head hard. Bang! Everyone around was stunned. Aurora's eyes went black, her mind went blank, and she fell straight backward. However, in an instant, she reacted and broke out in a cold sweat. In her previous life, she had a crush on Lyra for a long time, and he didn't show much reaction. It was precisely this time that Lyra accidentally hit her head with a basketball and sent her to the school infirmary. And then the two of them started to have an interaction. This basketball was the beginning of her miserable life. She absolutely must not repeat the same mistakes. Not far away, she had already seen a familiar figure. She would recognize him even if he turned to ashes. The 19-year-old Lyra had his black broken hair wet with sweat on his forehead. His pale white skin had a hint of redness due to intense exercise. He was running towards this side anxiously with several teammates wearing basketball uniforms. She wasn't sure if it was an illusion, but she felt that Lyra's expression was very strange. It was hard to say whether he was anxious or excited. The way he looked at her was burning with a complex emotion. It must be an illusion. At this time in the previous life, Lyra was still very cold towards her. It was too late. Aurora clenched her fists tightly, her knuckles turning white. Before Lyra came over, she grabbed the collar of the person beside him. The person was taken aback, and the collar of his basketball uniform was pulled wide open by her, revealing his delicate collarbone wet with sweat inside. Take me to the infirmary. Otherwise, I'll make trouble for you. She held on to that person tightly and refused to let go. Sorry, my friend. Saving a life is better than building a 7-story pagoda. Good people will have a peaceful life. Sure enough, when that person heard her words, his action of trying to pull her hand away stopped. After a while, a somewhat playful voice came from above her head. Aurora, did you mistake me for someone else? This voice. Aurora was shocked all over and suddenly looked up. A handsome face appeared in front of her. His skin was slightly honey-colored, with sword-shaped eyebrows and starry eyes. When he looked at people, there was a hint of arrogance. Aurora was stunned. Blaze. Lyra's sworn enemy in the previous life. She had heard Lyra's cold Blaze several times, calling him a scoundrel and a good-for-nothing. When they were at school, one was the president of the student union and the other was the vice president of the student union. After leaving school, they started their own businesses. At first, the two of them were evenly matched and neither would give in to the other. Later, after Aurora died, Lyra had no interest in managing the company. And in the end, the company was acquired by Blaze. It seems that this game was played by him and Blaze together again. Lyra's voice had already sounded from behind. She wasn't sure if he had run too fast, but there was actually a tremor in his voice. He said, "Hey, are you okay? I'll take you to the school infirmary to have a look." Just hearing his voice, Aurora's body couldn't help but tremble. For a moment, intense emotions like a huge wave swept through her entire body, and she had to clench her teeth tightly to prevent herself from making a sound. She thought she had let go, but it turned out she hadn't. When she saw Lyra again, the hatred hidden in her heart erupted violently, almost burning away her reason. He tortured her to death, and he killed her child. Between them was a blood-stained human life. At this moment, she almost wanted to stab Lyra to death directly. Aurora used all her strength to barely control herself. She squeezed out a sentence through her teeth, "I want Blaze to take me." Everyone around was surprised. It was an open secret that Aurora liked Lyra. She had passionately confessed to Lyra downstairs in the boys' dormitory just last month. She also sent him breakfast every day, skipped her own classes to follow Lyra to his classes, just to take a few more looks at him. This matter was well known in the school. Lyra had neither refused nor agreed. Some people even posted a bet on the school's online forum on whether she could win Lyra over. Why did she reject Lyra now when he was offering to take her to the infirmary? Her roommate Willow secretly pushed her and whispered, "Are you out of your mind?" Aurora gritted her teeth and didn't say anything, just held on to Blaze tightly and wouldn't let him leave. Everyone was watching the scene, and the situation was at a standstill for a while. And she felt the chest of the person in front of her tremble. And he said playfully, "Don't be so enthusiastic. You're about to tear my clothes off. I'll take you. Okay?" Before Aurora could react, she suddenly found herself lifted into the air. She was carried in a princess hold. She instinctively wrapped her arms around Blaze's neck and let out a cry of surprise. Blaze, not minding making things more exciting, turned around and twitched the corners of his mouth at Lyra. Then he walked towards the school hospital with big steps while holding her. "Then we'll go first." Lyra's expression immediately darkened, and his face looked extremely ugly. He stood there straight, staring at the backs of the two of them. He didn't move, but there were turbulent emotions suppressed in his eyes. His fists hanging by his sides were clenched tightly. Aurora bit her lip and didn't look back. Lyra just stared fixedly at Blaze carrying Aurora away until his eyes ached. No, this wasn't how it should be. In the previous life, it was clearly him who took her to the infirmary. There, she blushed and confessed to him again. He had always known that she liked him. But at the moment when the young girl lowered her head, he was inexplicably moved. Then their story began. I just didn't expect that such a sweet beginning would end up being so unbearable. When he first woke up, he was stunned for a long time. His thoughts were so complicated that he couldn't think of anything. Only the surprise in his subconscious slowly welled up and eventually became uncontrollable. In his previous life, he thought he hated Aurora. Her father drove drunk and went in the wrong direction, causing a collision in which none of the 4 people in the 2 cars survived. And that day was his birthday. And his parents were on their way back to see him after buying a cake. Lyra hated that man to the core and wished he could kill him again with his own hands. When he learned that Aurora was the daughter of that man, he almost collapsed. He ran out like crazy, drove to the mountain road where his parents had an accident, and knelt there for a whole night. It rained heavily that day, and it felt as if he was being tortured. There wasn't a single part of his body that didn't hurt. However, all those physical pains couldn't compare to the pain in his heart. He hadn't cried for more than 10 years. But on that day, he cried so much that he couldn't stand up straight. All his affection for Aurora turned into hatred that night. He secretly swore in his heart to avenge his parents. He wanted the daughter of his enemy to die a miserable death. However, the moment he went back and saw Aurora's concerned eyes, he completely surrendered. He found that he couldn't bring himself to hurt her. In the following dozen or so years, every time he thought back, it was an excruciating pain. He couldn't let go of his hatred. Nor could he let go of his love. Love and hate intertwined and fermented over time, turning into a monster covered in thorns that wounded both of them. The love they once had long been distorted beyond recognition, leaving only pain. In order to take revenge on Aurora, he even found a woman and had a child with her, showing off in front of her when she lost her own child. She was indeed as miserable as he had expected. He still remembered the first time he brought the child born to Sable in front of Aurora. Her face turned deathly pale, and she looked as if she was about to collapse at any moment. But she gritted her teeth so hard that her lips bled, yet she still didn't fall. However, for some reason, he didn't feel the slightest bit of pleasure from revenge. Instead, he even felt that he was more miserable than Aurora. Later, Aurora also found out what was going on. They tacitly chose not to get a divorce but to hurt and torture each other. It's ridiculous to say that even in this regard, they were so in tune with each other. He thought they would be entangled until they grew old. But he didn't expect to receive the news of her death so soon. The day after New Year's Eve, the caregiver told him that Aurora was dead. His first reaction was that it was absurd. How could it be possible? How could Aurora be dead? They were fated to be entangled until death. They hadn't determined who could hurt the other more. And the game wasn't over yet. How could she leave the stage without even saying a word? He didn't believe that Aurora was already dead. He thought this was another means of her revenge on him. But it wasn't until he dragged her into the sunlight and saw her face that had no trace of blood, almost whiter than the snow on the ground. Her expression was very calm, as if death had taken away all her love and hatred. At that moment, Lyra suddenly felt an excruciating pain in his heart, so intense that he couldn't stand upright and could only barely squat down. But this wasn't the most painful part. The most painful moment was when he saw that missed call. He felt as if his heart had been suddenly pulled out. And his heart was empty, with the cold wind blowing through it. His whole body seemed to be frozen. Lyra wanted to ask what she had really wanted to say in that last call. Was it to scold him? Or to make peace with him? Or maybe she had nothing to say. But there was no one who could answer him anymore. He thought that he would let go after she left, but those emotions grew stronger day by day. That missed call haunted his mind all day long. He dreamed of her or calling him with a pale face all night long. However, when he anxiously asked her what she wanted to say, she would hang up the phone without saying a word. And a missed call would appear on the phone. And he would wake up suddenly, covered in cold sweat. That call became the demon in his heart that he couldn't get rid of for the rest of his life. Sable couldn't stand it anymore. But this woman who was used to take revenge on her, Aurora lost even her last bit of use after Aurora's death. He left her without hesitation and then spent the next few decades of his life missing Aurora. Strangely enough, when she was alive, she seemed to have so many flaws. And he hated her deeply every time he thought of her. But after she died, all her flaws seemed to disappear. and only her goodness remained. He died on the same New Year's Eve night as Aurora did. There was the same huge snowfall. And he was also alone. Before his consciousness faded away, he had only one thought. What was Aurora feeling before she died? Was she also thinking of him? Just like he was thinking of her? When he opened his eyes again, Lyra had returned to the age of 19. Before he got together with Aurora. Before he even realized it. Joy welled up like waves one after another. He thought that the past was gone. And their grudges had been settled in the previous life. In this life, they could start anew. He wouldn't treat her like that again. They could have a good relationship this time. But how could it have turned out like this? It was supposed to be him sending her to the infirmary. So how did it end up being Blaze? Lyra looked at their disappearing backs and barely suppressed the panic in his heart. Maybe she was just shy. This was just a small change. In the previous life, it was always her chasing after him. In this life, he would chase after her instead. After being picked up by Blaze, Aurora belatedly panicked. Blaze was a national second level athlete. His muscles were strong and beautiful. When he held her, she only felt that the place where they made contact was so hot that it made her flustered. Blaze didn't waste any words. He put her on the bed and immediately called the doctor. "I'm sorry for hitting you. If you need anything in the future, just come to me." As he spoke, he took out his phone and opened the WeChat QR code. Aurora was taken aback for a moment. "Didn't Lyra hit me?" Oh, no. Blaze grinned, casually wiped his sweat-drenched hair back, revealing his smooth forehead. He looked as unruly as a wild wolf. "I just made a 3-point shot. And that bastard Lyra blocked it. It was me who hit you." Aurora couldn't quite describe how she felt. She had always thought that the ball that started their story was thrown by Lyra. It turned out that it wasn't him. It turned out that from the very beginning, everything was wrong. But these things were no longer important. She nodded and thanked Blaze. "I'm fine. Thank you for sending me to the infirmary. You can go back and get busy. Don't worry. I'll send you back the same way I brought you here. What if you have a concussion?" Aurora looked at Blaze's carefree appearance and felt annoyed. Damn it. This guy has such a mean mouth. Why can't he wish me well? The doctor came to examine her. After asking a few questions, he smiled. "There's nothing serious. It's just a minor abrasion. Go back and apply some iodine. After it heals, apply some scar removal cream to prevent scarring." "Will there really be a scar?" Blaze frowned. "It's possible," the doctor said as he packed his things. "It depends on whether you're a scar-prone person or not." Aurora unconsciously touched the wound on her forehead. In her previous life, there was indeed a scar here. A very faint one. She usually covered it with her bangs. When she died, that scar was still there. Blaze hesitated and glanced at Aurora. Then said in a low voice, "Then won't your appearance be ruined? If this affects your chances of finding a partner." He gritted his teeth, looking like he was ready to sacrifice himself. "Then you can come to me." What on earth is all this? Aurora rolled her eyes at Blaze speechlessly. "Shut up." Blaze didn't take it to heart. "I'm just kidding." As he spoke, he grabbed Aurora's arm. "Come on. I'll send you back. Actually, heading fulfilled Lad Sasho." Aurora didn't want to be with Blaze anymore. Blaze had an extremely high rate of attracting attention when walking on the street. If they were seen together again, it would be hard to explain. But Blaze didn't care. He insisted on sending her back, saying that he was afraid she would blackmail him. Aurora had no choice but to follow him back to the dormitory. When they reached the dormitory door, she waved to Blaze. "All right. Go back. I won't blackmail you. Don't be afraid." Blaze stood in the sunlight with his hands in his pockets and smiled at her. Aurora was stunned for a moment. Lyra rarely smiled. In the previous life, when they first got together, even if Lyra smiled occasionally, it was just a faint smile. Later, it was all sneers. But Blaze's smile was different. Just like his name. It was warm and passionate. Bright and dazzling. He said, "I'm serious. If your appearance is rude, and it affects your chances of finding a partner, come to me. I'll reluctantly make do with you." Aurora was full of annoyance and waved her hand impatiently before turning around and going upstairs. She didn't see that around the corner of the girls' dormitory, Lyra, who was holding a medicine pack, had his face instantly turn cold when he heard these words. The medicine pack was tightly squeezed by him until it was deformed. The next evening, during the last class, as soon as Aurora found a place to sit down and play with her phone, someone sat down next to her. She thought it was her roommate. She turned around with a smile, ready to speak, but was stunned when she saw who it was. Lyra was sitting beside her. His eyes looking at her were a bit complicated, but there was a smile on his brows and eyes. He seemed a bit nervous. He pursed his lips and said, "What a coincidence. You also chose this course?" Aurora frowned. In her previous life, Lyra clearly hadn't chosen the same course as her. It was always her who chased after him to attend his classes. Had she remembered it wrong? She didn't say anything. She forcefully suppressed the urge to slap Lyra and, with a cold face, planned to get up and change her seat. Every second spent with him would remind her of how unbearable their past was. Even the memories were full of bloody pain. But there were too many people in this psychology class. There were already people sitting on both sides. And the teacher had already walked onto the podium and started to open the teaching materials. Aurora had no choice but to close her eyes and endure sitting there. Lyra didn't expect Aurora to show such disgust. Clearly, having close out wide session. At this time in the previous life, she was still chasing after him with great enthusiasm. Why had she suddenly become so cold? His first reaction was that Blaze had said something to her yesterday. In the previous life, at the beginning, he really didn't have any feelings for Aurora. And he had also complained to his brothers around him that her constant pestering made him annoyed. Perhaps that bastard Blaze had spoken ill of him behind his back, which was why she was being so cold. Lyra felt a sudden sense of unease for no apparent reason. But he quickly suppressed it. It didn't matter. This time, he would take the initiative. She had loved him so much before, and this time she would definitely be moved by him. He sat beside Aurora, feeling the faint rose fragrance coming from her. In the previous life, she really liked the smell of roses. The quilts, having consulted clothes, and towels at home were all imbued with the delicate fragrance. But later, after she left, the house was empty. And that fragrance was never there again. When he smelled the familiar rose scent again, he couldn't help but feel his eyes sting. And he almost shed tears. Before Aurora died, they had been in a cold war for more than 10 years and had never sat down and had a good talk. 20 years after her death, meeting her again had even become a luxury. Even in his dreams. He didn't know if it was because she hated him and refused to appear in his dreams. In the entire 20 years, he could count on one hand the number of times he had dreamed of her. Now, being able to sit beside her again, seeing that she was alive and well, and that they were both fine, he felt so happy that he wanted to cry. But Aurora didn't think the same way. Throughout the whole class, Aurora was suffering, feeling as if she was sitting on pins and needles. As soon as the bell rang for the end of the class, she rushed out of the classroom without looking back, not even glancing at Lyra. She didn't know if Lyra was acting crazy or if the world line had changed. In any case, this time she wouldn't give them any chance to get entangled again. After leaving the classroom, Aurora suddenly remembered that the bedboard in her dormitory was broken and she hadn't gone to get a new one yet. It was already too late at this time. She called the dormitory supervisor, who said that the logistics department had already gotten off work. However, there should still be someone in the school warehouse and told her to go and check by herself. The autumn night was a bit chilly. She tightened her clothes and trotted all the way to the school warehouse. But she found that there was no one at the door. Only a cigarette that hadn't been finished placed on an aluminum can as an ashtray. It seemed that the warehouse keeper had gone out for something urgent. After thinking for a while, she entered the warehouse by herself. Their school had loose management. Several times before when they came to look for things, the warehouse keeper had let them search on their own. They just needed to register directly after finding what they wanted. It wasn't yet the time to get off work, so the keeper shouldn't have left. It was very dark in the warehouse. The electric lights were quite old, and it was so dim that it was almost impossible to see things clearly. She could only bend over turn on the flashlight on her phone, and search slowly. It took her more than 20 minutes to see the bedboard. She walked over and lifted it with effort, but was choked by the flying dust and coughed a few times. "Do you want me to help you?" Suddenly, a voice came from behind in the quiet darkness. Aurora felt as if all the blood in her body had been drained in an instant, and a chill rose from the soles of her feet. Her soul was so scared that it seemed to fly out of her body. She turned her head stiffly. A tall figure slowly emerged from the dimness behind her. The dim light barely illuminated Blaze's face. He was holding a cigarette in his mouth and carrying a stool in his hand. Seeing that Aurora didn't say anything, he frowned and said, "Are you stunned?" Aurora's heart was pounding with fright, and she was so angry that her teeth itched. If the bedboard hadn't been too heavy, she would have picked it up and slapped Blaze with it. She said angrily, "Why are you being so sneaky? You scared me to death." Blaze said in surprise, "No good deed goes unpunished. Right? Fine. Then carry it by yourself." With that, he carried the stool and walked out neatly. Aurora gritted her teeth. No wonder Lyra and Blaze fought each other tooth and nail in the previous life. They were just birds of a feather. Both of them were so annoying. She trotted after him. She was a bit scared because it was too dark in the warehouse. As a result, when she turned a corner, she was stunned. The warehouse door that had been open just now was actually closed. Blaze frowned, went up and pushed the door hard a few times. But the door didn't move at all. He shouted a few more times, but there was no response from outside. Damn it! Blaze took the cigarette out of his mouth, frowned and cursed. Is it really that unlucky? Aurora panicked at once. Ignoring the bedboard, she quickly went up and pushed the door together, shouting, "Hello? Is there anyone there? There are people in the warehouse. Let us out. Hello." After struggling for a long time, she was exhausted from shouting. She sat down against the door panel helplessly, patting the door feebly with her hand. The signal in the warehouse was very poor, and she couldn't even make a phone call. Blaze glanced at her and said, "Stop shouting. It's useless. That old man who manages the warehouse often leaves work early." "Then what should we do?" Aurora said anxiously. "It's okay. He'll come to open the door at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Blaze said infuriately, "Tonight, we'll be a man and a woman alone in this room." "Shut up." Seeing that Blaze was still being mean-spirited at this moment, Aurora couldn't stand it anymore and cursed. "It's all your fault. If you hadn't scared me just now, and I had come out quickly, maybe we wouldn't have been locked in." Blaze glanced at her, frowned and said, "Are all women so unreasonable? No wonder Lyra doesn't like you." At the mention of Lyra's name, Aurora fell silent. She had always known that Lyra didn't like her, and she was clear about it both in her previous life and in this life. He liked Sable. It was she who had been chasing after him all the time. If she hadn't fallen in love with him, perhaps her life wouldn't have been so miserable. The memories of the past welled up in her heart, and it was all so cold. She lowered her head and didn't say anything, gripping her phone tightly. Seeing that she didn't speak, Blaze regretted that he had spoken without thinking just now. The little girl was full of thoughts about love. Everyone knew that she liked Lyra. He shouldn't have spoken so directly. He extinguished the cigarette butt, thought for a while, and leaned over to comfort her, saying, "I was wrong. He might still like you. I saw him buying scar-removing medicine when I went back yesterday. He'll probably give it to you in the next couple of days." Aurora remained silent, burying her head in her knees. After a while, her body began to tremble slightly. Thinking of Lyra, she would think of the child who had only accompanied her for a few months but was killed. The darkness fueled her sad emotions, and she suddenly burst into tears. Blaze panicked. For the first time, he regretted his mean words. He patted Aurora's back clumsily, at a loss. Hey. I was wrong. Okay? I'm apologizing to you." Aurora was immersed in her own emotions and ignored him. Blaze frowned and said, "Do you like Lyra that much? What's so good about that guy?" Okay. Stop crying. I'll tie him up and bring him to you later. Okay? If he dares not to like you, I'll beat the hell out of him." Aurora continued to sob. Blaze was completely panicked this time. He wasn't afraid of anything in the world. But in his life, he was only afraid of my sandwomen crying. He patted Aurora and racked his brains, saying, "I'm much better than that guy Lyra. How about I be with you? What do you think of me?" Aurora couldn't stand it anymore and pushed him away, saying, "Are you crazy?" Seeing that she was paying attention to him, Blaze felt relieved. He grabbed Aurora's hand and placed it on his stomach, saying proudly, "I have 8-pack abs. That guy Lyra only has 6-pack abs. Seriously, why don't you like me instead?" The abs under her hand were well defined, with firm and hot muscles. Aurora was taken aback and quickly pulled her hand back, blushing all over her face. The gloomy mood was completely dispelled by this idiot's actions. Aurora had never seen such a rascal before. She blushed and couldn't say a word. She turned her back and didn't want to talk to Blaze. Blaze laughed for a while and pushed her. "Are you angry?" Aurora pouted angrily and didn't say anything. Sure enough, Lyra always said that Blaze was a scoundrel. And he really was a scoundrel. Seeing that she was really angry, Blaze didn't bother her anymore. He stood up and walked away. It seemed that he was rummaging for something in the dark. Aurora was a bit curious but didn't have the nerve to turn around and look. After a while, the sound of footsteps gradually approached, and a playing card appeared in front of Aurora. Presumably, it was left here by the warehouse keeper. "Okay. I'll do a magic trick for you. Please don't be mad at me anymore." Aurora tilted her head. And Blaze was curling his lips and looking at her. As the saying goes, a beauty looks even more charming by the light of a lamp. Under the dim light, Blaze's deep and intense eyes cast a shadow on his face. His perfect jawline was tensed, and there was a smile on his lips. Facing such a nearly perfect face, even the greatest anger would fade away. Aurora gave him an annoyed look. "What kind of magic trick?" Blaze grinned, and the playing card in his hand fluttered up and down smoothly. "Pick a card. I guarantee I'll know which card you picked." "I don't believe it." "If you don't believe it, pick a card." Blaze held the cards in front of Aurora. Aurora casually picked a card, took a look at it, and then put it back, making sure Blaze didn't see it during the whole process. Blaze looked at her deeply with his dark eyes. And then he kept shuffling the cards without stopping. After shuffling for a while, he opened the cards and casually picked one and placed it in front of Aurora. "The 3 of diamonds. Is that right?" Aurora opened her eyes in surprise and said, "How did you know?" Blaze glanced at her sideways and said, "Am I amazing?" Aurora became interested and said, "How did you do it? Teach me." Blaze proudly put away the playing cards and said, "It's not impossible. Call me brother, and I'll teach you." As soon as Aurora heard that this scoundrel was being mean again, the smile on her face faded. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Seeing that she was about to get angry again, Blaze smiled helplessly and said, "I really give in to you. You're really a tough one. Come on. I'll teach you. I'll teach you." With that, he picked up the playing card and said, "This was the card you chose just now, right? When you put it back, you need to remember the card next to it. And then just find that card next to it." With that, he handed the playing cards to Aurora and said, "You try it." Aurora took the cards but didn't hold them properly. And the playing cards fell to the ground one after another. "You're so clumsy." Blaze sighed and bent down to pick up the cards. Aurora also quickly bent down to pick them up. When they were picking up the last card, the 3 of diamonds, they both reached out to take it at the same time. And Blaze's hand suddenly covered Aurora's hand. Blaze often played basketball, and his fingers were a bit rough and hard. Aurora felt that the hand on hers was extremely hot, making her body tremble slightly, almost imperceptibly. Blaze felt that the hand under his was tender and slender, icy cold, like jade. Both of them remained in that position without moving. For a moment, the whole warehouse fell into silence, and an awkward and ambiguous atmosphere slowly arose in the air, and the surrounding temperature began to rise. I don't know how long it took, but Blaze suddenly withdrew his hand. He was uncharacteristically silent. He sat there quietly, looking down at the card in his hand, as if there was something on the playing card that he was particularly interested in. Aurora stole a glance at him. She wasn't sure if she was seeing things. But it seemed that even Blaze's ears had turned red. Neither of them said anything. They sat quietly in the dark warehouse. And the dim light couldn't clearly show each other's faces. After a while, Blaze spoke first. Well, that's the way it is. Are you sleepy? He stammered a bit, and his words seemed irrelevant. But for some reason, Aurora felt that her face was getting hotter and hotter. A bit sleepy. I'll take a little nap first. Actually, she wasn't sleepy at all. But she felt a bit embarrassed and didn't know what to say. So she just sat there and closed her eyes, pretending to doze off. Blaze was rustling around beside her. And Aurora hadn't intended to fall asleep. But she had been so emotionally agitated these days that she hadn't slept well. She didn't know when her consciousness began to blur. When she opened her eyes again, she didn't know how much time had passed. She was leaning on Blaze's shoulder, and Blaze's coat was covering her. A faint smell of fresh laundry detergent lingered at the tip of her nose. Seeing that she was awake, Blaze turned his head and asked a silly question. Are you awake? For some reason, Aurora felt uncomfortable all over. Yeah. You didn't sleep? Blaze raised the corner of his mouth and said. You slept like a pig. And you drooled all over my shoulder. I couldn't fall asleep. Aurora was panicked and quickly reached out to touch his shoulder. The fabric under her hand was dry. And she only felt the firm muscles. Blaze looked at her and smiled. Aurora became angry from embarrassment and slapped him hard. I think you must be seriously ill. Before she could finish her words, the door of the warehouse was suddenly pushed open with great force. The flowing air stirred up dust, and Aurora turned her head in surprise. In the darkness, a figure appeared, gasping for breath as he pushed open the door. With just one glance, she recognized who it was. Lyra. The light in the warehouse was not very clear, but it was enough to see that the two people were sitting together. And Aurora's hand was still on Blaze. Lyra's face turned livid, and he walked straight over, grabbed Aurora, and pulled her up, angrily shouting, Do you know that I've been looking for you all night? Are you just here fooling around with another man? Aurora was stunned. She rarely saw Lyra this angry. Lyra was indifferent, sarcastic, and condescending. He should never be so emotional and show his feelings so openly. What are you talking about? Blaze was the first to be unhappy. Our relationship is pure. Pure. He stammered about being pure for a while. But his own face gradually turned slightly red, and he didn't know what else to say. Shut up. Lyra was burning with anger. Come out with me. As he spoke, he exerted force with his hand and dragged her out of the warehouse. His strong pull instantly reminded Aurora of the night when he pushed her down the stairs. The color rained from her face in an instant. And she almost frantically shook off his hand and couldn't help but slap him. Let go. Lyra turned his face aside and was stunned. After a long while, he turned back to look at Aurora in disbelief and said, You hit me? His expression gradually became crazy. He firmly grasped her shoulders and said word by word, I've been looking for you all night. How dare you hit me? Aurora. What on earth have I done wrong? Aurora's face was deathly pale, and she stared fixedly at Lyra in front of her. The more she had loved him in the past, the more she hated him now. She wished she could cut his heart out to see if it was really made of iron. But she quickly realized that this Lyra hadn't reached that stage with her yet and hadn't hurt her. She lowered her head and bit her lip tightly. After a moment, she said with difficulty, Sorry. I was impulsive just now. I used to pester you. And I've thought about it. It was my fault. I won't bother you anymore. Let's go our separate ways and just be classmates. When Aurora slapped him, Lyra was suddenly shocked. And his whole body felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. His first reaction was that since Aurora hated him so much, could it be that she had also been reborn? This speculation made his whole body go cold, and his mind went blank. He knew that, given their mutual hatred in the previous life, if Aurora had really been reborn, it would be impossible for her to forgive him. But it couldn't be possible. Aurora had died 20 years earlier than him. How could they both be reborn together? Lyra's mind was in a complete mess. But when he heard the word pester, he felt relieved. Most likely. Blaze had told her that he had once said he was annoyed by her pestering. It didn't matter. He would atone for his sins. He could apologize and admit his mistakes. And he could win her back. Did that bastard Blaze say something nonsense to you? Lyra said a little nervously, I don't dislike you. Before. I wasn't in my right mind. I actually like you. Aurora. How about we start dating? He stared at the girl in front of him without blinking. Not willing to take his eyes off her for a moment. How long had it been? How long had it been since he had looked at her like this? A 19-year-old Aurora was full of youthful vitality. She was so passionate. When she loved him, it was with great fervor. And when she hated him, she was just as resolute. In his previous life, he had missed so much. It was all her father's fault. In his previous life, he had been blinded by hatred and had been bent on revenge. Why hadn't he thought that she had also lost her parents? Her closest relatives. In that car accident and was a victim just like him? Fortunately, having fulfilled land say. Now. It was still not too late. An indescribable hatred welled up in Aurora's heart. She didn't feel the slightest bit of joy. She just thought it was ridiculous. She thought. How dare he? How dare Lyra? She suddenly remembered that after she lost her child in her previous life, just after she had an abortion and returned home, her lower body was still dully aching and bleeding. And when she would have nightmares and wake up crying at night, Lyra had brought Sable back to their home. At that time, Sable had just given birth less than half a year ago and had come back with their son to show off in front of her. The child was small and white. Sucking his finger in the blanket with his eyes closed, he was almost the same as the child in her dreams. At that moment, she felt as if 1,000 arrows were piercing her heart. The pain in her heart was so intense that she could hardly stand and almost fell down. But she still held on. She knew that Lyra had brought the child here just to make fun of her. And she wouldn't let him have his way. Fortunately, having fulfilled this Lyra hadn't had the chance to do anything yet. If it were the Lyra from her previous life here, she would not hesitate to kill him. She used all her strength to suppress herself and not show any strangeness. She said coldly, You're being too self-absorbed. I'm not interested in you now. With that, she turned around and left. Lyra was stunned and instinctively reached out to pull her. But the moment he touched her finger, she suddenly shook off his hand. Her face was filled with such disgust, as if she had touched something dirty. She quickened her pace and soon disappeared in front of him. Lyra's hand froze in midair, and he stared blankly at her retreating back. Blaze walked out from behind, looking not too happy. The faint rose fragrance of the girl still seemed to linger around him. He didn't know what was wrong with him. The moment he saw Lyra push open the door, he actually wanted to kick him back. He glanced at Lyra, put his hands in his pockets, and walked forward. After walking a few steps, Lyra spoke from behind. In the chilly autumn night, his voice was colder than the night itself. Stay away from Aurora. Blaze frowned and turned back. Didn't you say you didn't like her? But Lyra stared at him, like a hungry wolf guarding its only prey. Blaze. If you still consider me a friend, don't compete with me. Blaze felt inexplicably annoyed and said coldly, Whatever. With that, he turned around and left. It was already past 4 o'clock in the morning when Lyra came looking for her. Aurora climbed into the dormitory building to the side door while the dorm supervisor was asleep. Lying on the bed, she thought back to the words Lyra had said today. She had suspected whether Lyra had also been reborn. After all, since such a strange thing as being reborn could happen to her, it didn't seem strange for it to happen to Lyra. But Lyra's attitude was wrong. He hated her so much. If he had been reborn, he probably wouldn't have been nice to her. How could he possibly like her? Remembering how nervous and inexperienced he had looked when he said he liked her today, Aurora felt a bitter taste in her heart that was hard to describe. Lyra's love was the most heartless and cruel thing in the world, in this life and the next. She didn't dare to have anything to do with it again. The next day was the weekend. Since she hadn't slept well the night before, Aurora slept until the afternoon. Since she was reborn, she had been having constant nightmares. In her dreams, there was either Lyra's heartless face or the child she had lost. However, This time, she didn't dream of these things. Instead, she dreamed of Blaze. It was still in that dark warehouse. And her hand was overlapping with Blaze's. The scorching and ambiguous atmosphere suddenly exploded. Blaze gradually leaned closer to her. His pitch-black eyes stared at her firmly, exuding an undeniable sense of oppression. Just before their lips touched, she woke up with a start. Her face was so hot that it seemed to be smoking. And she was soaked in sweat. Aurora was stunned for a second, and then she covered her head in shame and annoyance. She had been a widow for more than 30 years. Both when she was alive and after her death in her previous life. How could she be interested in a 19-year-old boy? It was a sin. Thinking of Blaze's face, she let out a sigh. It wasn't that her resistance was too weak. It was just that the enemy was too good-looking for her to resist. In the following few days, Lyra still often came to look for her. But it seemed that he had been intimidated by her last time. Every time, he just watched her from a distance and didn't get close. Blaze seemed to have gone to play in a basketball game with the school team and hadn't been seen for a long time. Aurora felt a bit disappointed for no apparent reason. After the last class in the evening, Willow behind her caught up with her, grabbed her, and said out of breath, "The art club is having a welcome party for new members tonight. Hurry up and change your clothes. Let's go together." Aurora thought for a while and then remembered that she had joined an art club when she entered university. In fact, it was a club for painting. She quickly went back to change her clothes, touched up her makeup a bit, and then took a taxi with Willow to the music restaurant where the party was held. There were already a lot of people sitting in the booths of the restaurant. The light was dim, and she couldn't see people clearly. She rushed over and sat down. But the moment she saw the person next to her, she was stunned. Lyra was smiling at her, looking a bit nervous. "You're here? Are you thirsty? Have some water." He poured a glass of water for her a bit nervously and quickly withdrew his hand as if afraid she would refuse. It turned out that the so-called new member they were welcoming today was him. The president of the student union was here. No wonder it was so grand. Aurora's face turned cold. She was just about to change her seat when she saw a familiar face across from her. After not seeing each other for a long time, the 19-year-old Sable still wore her emotions on her face. She was gritting her teeth and looking at Aurora with an unfriendly gaze. Aurora was slightly distracted. Did she hate Sable? Undoubtedly. She did. Like Lyra, Sable was the murderer who had killed her child. But after she died, she had watched Sable and Lyra go their separate ways. Sable had ultimately failed to keep Lyra. She had been living alone with her child. Lyra hadn't treated Sable well. After she died, he had hardly said a word to Sable. Sable had shed tears all night long. But no matter how sad and crazy she was, she couldn't win his heart back. Sable was hateful, but she was just a pitiful person who couldn't get the love she desired. Just like herself. They had both fallen in love with the same man. And that was why they hadn't had a good life. In just this moment of distraction, all the empty seats beside her were filled, leaving only the seat next to her. Just as she was about to move over, a hand casually landed on her shoulder. Aurora looked up in surprise. And Blaze had a smile at the corner of his eye. "Make some room. Save a seat for me." As he spoke, without waiting for an invitation, he sat down beside Aurora. Goodness. It turned out that both the president and vice president of the student union were here. No wonder they suddenly decided to hold a welcome party for new members. However, Aurora looked at Blaze suspiciously. Could this guy paint? Surely magic couldn't be considered an art, right? Blaze seemed very happy and had a smile on his face all the time. But the moment Lyra saw Blaze, his face darkened. He said in an unfriendly tone, "What are you doing here?" Blaze was happily drinking beer. "I'm sacrificing myself for art. I love painting the most. Don't you know that? Go to hell." Lyra couldn't stand it anymore and pointed at Blaze, cursing, heading wide sashing. "You can't even hold a pen properly. What the hell can you paint?" The smile didn't reach Blaze's eyes. He slowly put the beer glass on the table and raised his chin towards Lyra. "Who the hell are you to care about me? Whether I paint a chicken or a pig has nothing to do with you. Can't I come here to soak up some artistic atmosphere?" Lyra poked at him with his finger. Fine. Aurora never expected that these two would actually start arguing. She covered her face while being caught in the middle of them. The club president quickly came out to smooth things over. Stop arguing. We're having a happy welcome party today. Let's play a game. Truth or dare. As she spoke, she took out a wine bottle and placed it on the table. Whoever the bottle points to will be the one. A group of people burst into laughter and watched the bottle spinning rapidly on the table. The bottle first pointed to a girl with short hair. After thinking for a while, she chose dare. The boy who spun the bottle grinned and asked, "Go to the table next door and take a bite of their food." The girl with short hair seemed to be a playful person. Without hesitation, she took a pair of chopsticks and went to the next table, patted the boy at that table, and said something. The boy was stunned for a moment and then smiled. She took the food and came back successfully. In front of everyone at the table, she said proudly, "How about it? The vice president is awesome." Everyone ruckus laughed together. The game got more and more exciting. And everyone drank a lot of wine. Getting drunk. Sable was also pointed at once in the middle. Sable didn't hesitate and chose truth. The girl with short hair asked her, "Okay. I'll ask you. Is there anyone you like at this table?" Sable said firmly, "Yes." She stared at Lyra without blinking. Everyone at the table was excited and started clapping and cheering. "Oh oh oh. Awesome. Who is it?" "That's the next question." Sable's face turned slightly red, and she stubbornly looked at Lyra. Lyra looked at Sable with a complicated expression. This woman was used by him to hurt her Aurora in the previous life. Both of them owed her Aurora. But he also owed Sable. In this life, let her find her own happiness. He lowered his head to avoid her gaze. Sable's face turned pale, and she slowly lowered her head to drink. "Keep going." The club president was drunk and slurred as she continued to spin the bottle. The bottle spun rapidly on the glass table, gradually slowing down. Finally, heading fulfilled lay. It moved slightly in front of Lyra and turned towards Aurora. Aurora was stunned. After hesitating for a moment, she chose dare. She didn't want to be asked if there was anyone she liked at the table. She didn't know how to answer. The girl with short hair thought for a while, pointed at her Aurora and grinned. "Okay. You choose the boy closest to you and give him a kiss. A French kiss." As soon as these words came out, more than a dozen people at the table all looked at her Aurora. When they saw the two people beside her, they all ruckus as if watching a good show. "Kiss him. Kiss him. Kiss him quickly." The girl with short hair meant well. She knew that her Aurora had always liked Lyra and wanted to give her a chance. But her Aurora was suddenly shocked, and all the blood in her body rushed to her head. On the left was Lyra, and on the right was Blaze. Which one should she choose? Lyra lowered his head, and his hand holding the wine glass unconsciously began to exert force. Blaze also turned his face aside and didn't dare to look at her. Aurora gave a bitter smile. "Can I just drink instead? This is going too far." "No." Everyone was drunk and couldn't wait to watch the excitement. The club president stammered. "The women in our art club never back down. Choose quickly." Aurora fell silent. Kissing Lyra was worse than death for her. But kissing Blaze? There was already a bit of an indescribable ambiguity between them. How could she bring herself to do it? As time passed, everyone started shouting, urging her to choose. Lyra closed his eyes, as if waiting for judgment. Aurora didn't even want to give him a look. After taking a deep breath, she gulped down the beer in the glass, stood up and pinched Blaze's face. Blaze was startled. And then the corners of his mouth couldn't help but rise slightly. He didn't break free. The color drained from Lyra's face, and he turned pale. "Sorry." Aurora gritted her teeth and was about to kiss Blaze. The lights in the music restaurant were dim and ambiguous. The band on the stage was singing, rippling. And the hoarse voice disturbed Aurora's heart, making her heart start to ripple as well. The slightly intoxicating aroma of beer intertwined with the breaths of the two people. In Blaze's obsidian-like eyes, her face that was getting closer and closer was reflected. Just a second before their lips touched, Lyra on the side suddenly stood up, and his expression was extremely ugly. Everyone fell silent and looked at this sudden scene in bewilderment. He forcefully pulled Aurora and dragged her to his side. Looking down at Blaze, he said fiercely, "Blaze, what the hell did you promise me? Have you forgotten?" Blaze's expression wasn't very good either since the kiss was interrupted. He leaned back on the booth seat, squinted his eyes, and the smile on his lips was somewhat sarcastic. "I changed my mind. Is that not allowed?" Lyra's face was filled with anger, and his fists clenched by his side were itching to fight. But he gritted his teeth and endured it, dragging Aurora out of the restaurant. The oncoming cold air hit both of them in the face, and they both sobered up instantly. Lyra seemed to be in great pain. He raised his head and sighed, looking at Aurora with a sad expression. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Aurora looked at Lyra and said word by word, "The drunk driver who killed your parents was my father. Do you know that?" Lyra was shocked and was about to open his mouth. But at the moment when the words were about to come out, he felt a chill all over his body. Aurora had indeed been reborn. She shouldn't know this at this time. She was testing him now. She suspected that he had also been reborn. At this time, he should still not know about this. If he said he didn't know, then he should be shocked and angry, unable to accept the reality. If he said he knew, it would mean that he had also been reborn. Lyra's mind was in a mess for a moment, not knowing what to say. Aurora opposite him sneered, "Lyra, you've also been reborn, haven't you?" These words were like a judgment. Lyra could hardly stand. He stood there motionless like a stone sculpture, not daring to look up at Aurora's expression. He knew that he was finished. Aurora had been reborn, and he had also been reborn. In their previous life, they had been in such an embarrassing situation. Her father had killed his parents, and he had killed their child. Between them was not only love and hate but also blood-stained human lives. Before he could speak, Aurora spoke again. She was clearly standing under the streetel twide, not far away. But it was as if there was an ocean between the two of them. The dim streetel twide couldn't add a touch of warmth to her at all. She said coldly, "Lyra, what on earth do you want? Wasn't it enough that you hurt me so much in the previous life? Do you want to do it again in this life?" She actually thought that. She actually thought that he was here to take revenge on her. The pain that came from his heart at this moment was no less than being pierced by 1,000 arrows. This pain made it almost impossible for Lyra to speak. After slightly bending over to relieve it for a moment, he said hoarsely, "How could you think of me like that? Why shouldn't I think of you like that?" Aurora seemed to have heard something ridiculous. "I'm just repeating what you did. Aren't I?" Yes. He had treated her like that in the previous life, and it was reasonable for her to be this angry. But I've already figured it out." Lyra took a step forward and said sorrowfully, "I was wrong in the previous life. I was full of hatred at that time. I'm sorry for you. And I will make it up to you. We've both been reborn now. We can start over. I will never be like before." "Aurora, don't you like children?" "We can." As soon as the words came out, Lyra's heart sank. And he secretly thought it was bad. Sure enough, Aurora's face instantly turned cold. Thick hatred filled her eyes. She clenched her fists tightly and squeezed out each word through her teeth. "Shut up. Lyra. You don't deserve to mention that child." Lyra opened his mouth and gave a bitter smile. "Okay. I deserve to die. I don't deserve to mention it. But Aurora, how can I make you forgive me? Or you can stab me. Okay? I'll pay for it with blood." His voice gradually took on a hint of a sob. He knelt down tremblingly and reached out to hold Aurora's ankle. "Let's start over. Okay? You don't know how I've lived in the 20 years after you died. I really love you. But I realized it too late." Aurora looked at Lyra kneeling in front of her and remained silent. She knew how proud Lyra was. He had always been arrogant and indifferent. She had never seen him kneel or cry, even in front of his parents' graves. Even when he first found out that the murderer of his parents was her father, he just tensed up all over and his eyes turned red for a moment. Lyra held Aurora's leg and sobbed uncontrollably. All the past regrets and grievances welled up in his heart at this moment, and he could hardly control himself. He wanted to tell her, "I really regret treating you like that. I really know I was wrong. Give me a chance to make it up to you. And I will definitely atone for my sins." He wanted to tell her, in the 20 years after you left, I was worse than dead. Every day, I was tortured by the longing for you. I lost my family and was all alone. Every day, I lived in the miss of you. And finally died on New Year's Eve. Just like the night you left. He also wanted to tell her, I really miss you so much that I can hardly bear it. Please. Can you just look at me? But his emotions were too overwhelming and blocked his throat. And he couldn't say anything. Listening to his suppressed sobs, Aurora's eyes gradually became sour. She raised her head to keep the tears from falling. She was extremely sad and thought, what the hell are we doing? What the hell is this all about? They had been reborn. But why couldn't she still get rid of all this? Lyra's tears soaked her pants. He pleaded, Aurora. Please give me another chance. Give me a chance to atone for my sins. Okay? You loved me so much. You can't abandon me. Aurora raised her head and wiped away her tears. Barely maintaining her calm and said, Lyra. I did love you. Very much. Lyra's body paused. And he raised his head. His eyes gradually lighting up. But. She looked at Lyra and said word by word. As if sentencing him with her words. The young man I loved has long been tortured to death by time and reduced to ashes in the passage of time. Lyra. She said in a trembling voice. I don't want to hate you anymore. And I don't love you either. Let's. Let each other go. Lyra stared at her blankly. He suddenly felt that the night wind was so cold that it hurt all over his body. And the pain was almost unbearable. Aurora slowly took a step back. Turned around. And walked away slowly. Lyra knelt there. Looking at her gradually disappearing back. And bent over slightly. It hurt so much. She said tortured to death. Tortured to death was just like this. Aurora was in tears as she walked on the way back. Well. She thought. It's okay like this. Both she and Lyra had been reborn. That was good. They could completely end their relationship. There were faint footsteps coming from the darkness behind her. She was a bit scared and turned her head to look. Blaze held a cigarette in his hand and naturally took off his coat and draped it over her. Finished talking? He looked at the girl in front of him with a complicated expression. He didn't know how he had fallen for this girl. The first time he knew about her aura was when she gave a big bag of snacks to everyone in their dormitory in order to chase Lyra. She smiled and said to inform her immediately if there was any news. At that time, he saw this girl standing at the dormitory door, thin and fair-skinned, sweating all over but smiling brightly. He thought to himself that this girl was really silly. When he looked for a wife in the future, he definitely couldn't find someone as silly as her, as it would affect the IQ of their offspring. Later, he watched as Aurora brought breakfast to Lyra, saved seats for him, and gave him water. When Lyra was playing basketball, she cheered on the side. When Lyra scored a goal, her little face turned red with excitement, and she cheered loudly. He had scoffed at it at that time. However, strangely enough, a trace of jealousy had secretly welled up in his heart. During that basketball game, he and Lyra had fought tooth and nail. After the game, Lyra even came over and scolded him, saying he was like a madman. All worked up. Only he knew that secretly in his heart, he had hoped that the girl would cast a glance at him. So when she grabbed his collar and asked him to send her to the infirmary, he picked her up without hesitation and didn't forget to show off triumphantly in front of Lyra. The subsequent things happened naturally. He confidently left his contact information. And they spent the night in the warehouse. Oh no. It was just until midnight. It was all that bastard Lyra's fault. It should have been the whole night. When Lyra told him not to compete with him, he was angry and embarrassed that his thoughts had been discovered. So he casually said that sentence. But soon he regretted it. When playing basketball in another place, he was surprised to find that for a whole month, he had been thinking about her every day. That thin and fair girl who smiled more brightly than the sun. Perhaps because they were both passionate people. They were destined to be attracted to each other. He shouldn't have come out tonight. However, he still couldn't help but follow her. He watched as Lyra cried and begged her to give him a chance. But she coldly refused. Blaze didn't know what had happened between them. Clearly, before, it was just Aurora's one-sided pursuit. But now it had become Lyra's desperate plea. Just like he didn't know why that girl who smiled so beautifully seemed so weathered when she cried. But he didn't care about these things. He knew that Lyra had no chance anymore. Next. It was his turn. Blaze. Aurora, wearing the coat, nodded gently. Yeah. I told you earlier that that guy is no good. Look at him. He usually acts like a big shot. But in fact, he doesn't know how to cherish a woman at all. Blaze didn't miss any opportunity to smear his love rival, and kept chattering and scolding Lyra. Aurora's overwhelming sadness was unexpectedly disrupted by him. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry and asked, "Are you better than him?" "Of course. That's for sure." Blaze grabbed Aurora's hand and lifted up his t-shirt, trying to press her hand against his abdomen. "Feel my abs. I have to more than Lyra." Aurora laughed and scolded as she pulled her hand back, but Blaze didn't let go. Her face turned hot. She felt Blaze slowly interlace his fingers with hers. And she didn't shake it off. Both of them fell silent and walked forward slowly, holding hands. Blaze turned his head away. "Well, if you don't have class tomorrow morning, shall we go out?" "What for?" Aurora said, blushing. "What for?" "For a date." "Of course. You're so stupid." Blaze tapped her on the head. "Are you crazy?" "You." In the dark alley. The moonlight elongated the shadows of the two people holding hands. After that last encounter, Lyra fell seriously ill and didn't come to class for over a month. It was said that he had stood outside all night, got a high fever, and finally developed pneumonia. He almost had to be sent to the emergency room. When he came back again, Aurora and Blaze were already together. He watched as the two of them sat together during the lecture, chatting softly. Blaze said something that made Aurora's face turn red, and she reached out to pinch him. Lyra couldn't help but feel a bit dazed. How long had it been since he last saw such a happy smile on her face? Since the first year of their marriage. The smile on her face had disappeared. In the following 12 years. Every time they met, there was only indifference and hatred left. 20 years after her death, he had almost forgotten that she used to be such a girl who loved to laugh. Lyra couldn't describe how he felt. It was sour and painful. As if he had been poured with sulfuric acid, corroded until his heart was empty and there was nothing left. However, there was also a sense of revenge that was almost pleasurable in his heart. He thought, was this how Aurora felt before she died? Now he finally felt it too. When the class was over, he stopped Aurora. Blaze looked a bit unhappy and rolled up his sleeves as if he was going to come over. But Aurora stopped him. She leaned close to his ear and said something affectionately. Blaze rolled his eyes and left reluctantly. Before leaving, he gave Lyra a glare. Lyra smiled bitterly and looked at Aurora. "You two are together?" Aurora was stunned for a moment and then smiled brightly. Yes. He had already known it. But when he heard her admit it with his own ears, his heart still ached unbearably. Lyra forced a smile. "How does he treat you?" "That bastard Blaze is so carefree. There are many things he doesn't think about. He has a strong body but a simple mind." His words were interrupted by Aurora. A smile appeared on her face because of hearing that person's name. It wasn't a sneer or a sarcastic laugh, but a genuine smile from the heart. She said, "I'm very happy being with him. Lyra, I've thought it through these days. If I can't let go of the hatred, it will only make the wound fester and consume me completely. I don't hate you anymore." She looked at him with a peaceful expression in her eyes. "Let's both be well. I wish you happiness." With that, she didn't give him a chance to speak and turned around and ran towards Blaze. Blaze seemed a bit awkward. Clearly, heading for Salvlayed. He was waiting for her. But he evaded when she reached out to hold his hand. It was only after she shook his arm for a while that he held her hand again. The two of them walked away, holding hands. Lyra watched silently. Once, all of this had belonged to him. It was because he hadn't cherished it that he ended up like this. He deserved it. But he really wanted to ask. Now that she had let go, what should he do? They had been entangled with each other all their lives. Now that she had finally let go, started a new life, and escaped from the quagmire of hatred and left him, he was left alone, trapped in this pool of venom. unable to extricate himself. What should he do? He stood there for a long time. It was only when Aurora's figure could no longer be seen clearly that Lyra reluctantly shifted his gaze and turned away. Looking lost. Perhaps Aurora was right. One day, having Sai, they would all let go. But without her, he would never be happy again.